Hi there, I'm home again at last, so welcome back to the mess, but things should run a little bit more smoothly for me. As promised, I wanted to provide you with some overview feedback before we got too far away from that last assignment or the first assignment that you did for us in this subject. So firstly, let me say we were super pleased with how well everybody did and the level or the standard of contributions. Clearly there are a number of people who left it very much to the last minute. There were quite a few logistical issues with this assignment. I'm quite frankly not sure how much of that was people not really paying attention to what they were asked to do and what was the complexity of our technology systems. I think a little bit from column A and a little bit from column B, to be perfectly frank. And so, yeah, there were some issues with it. It was also one of the challenges with this assignment for many people was that the word limit was very short and then kind of vague in relation to the conversation. So we were, and it was purposefully vague, what we were trying to do is encourage you to have a conversation that helped you really consolidate and reflect on your learning and to really think about what dealing with ethical rules in the profession will mean for you personally in the long run. And many of you, most of you in fact, did really, really well there. The average grade was in fact quite high, probably higher than we would expect to see normally overall. And I think that's a reflection in part of the enthusiasm and effort that you made. I know ours was one of the first assignments that was due in this semester, so you weren't quite as world weary as you are when you're submitting a first submission for a class in weeks 5 or 6. But also because it was relatively brief and relatively contained in its scope. Even so, there are a couple of things that we saw consistently with the people who didn't do as well. So in fact, I'll bring up and share with you what the overall marks look like. How's that for magic? So you can see in my roughly thrown together spreadsheet here, clearly there are a number of people who didn't submit. I mean, at the end of the day, the 0 marks are the ones who didn't submit. There are often reasons for that. Sometimes it's strategic, I get it. It's a 10% assignment very early on. You've got a lot of calls on your time, and so, you know, you'll make it up at some later time. I do have to say though that there is definitely a correlation between making efforts and learning, getting feedback from the early assignments and doing well at the end. That doesn't mean that if you didn't do as well as you hoped you would have in this first assignment that you can't do extremely well. There is definitely, we see that absolutely all the time, and often I must admit, I worry a little about the people who do extremely well early on because they tend to relax a little bit. Now, I don't want you to be super stressed out, don't get me wrong there, but you can relax too much too early and rest on your laurels a little bit. And let's face it, with law students, many of you have spent your whole lives being the smartest person in the room. And one of the reasons, quite frankly, why there are so many mental health issues in the profession and in law schools generally is that level of anxiety about whether or not you are keeping up is prevalent, and it's something that I really want you to be aware of. You know, it's probably a longer discussion for another time, but really looking after yourself and remembering that you are not your grades is fundamentally important to you surviving and thriving in law school and in the profession, and that's really important to us, and well, quite frankly it should be really important to you as well. So yeah, I want you to see that clearly there are some people, quite a few in fact, who about 5% by the looks of that, who actually it'll be a little bit less than that, probably about 3% who didn't submit. Then basically there were no fails from people who submitted. which is awesome. I really like to see that. Again, that's not that unusual, however, when we have assignments that are student-facing, when other students see your work. One of the things that I find really interesting is that you do better, you care more about what your peers think about your work sometimes than you care about what we think. Again, that's important because you're going to need to live and work with these peers in the real world. So yeah, again, not necessarily a bad thing. As you can see, the vast majority of you here got a grade that was somewhere between 12.5 and 15 out of 20. So that's pretty much the majority here are sitting in the credit or in the low end of the distinction range, which I think is fabulous. And our median and average marks were in the low 70s. Actually, sorry, the average was in the low 70s. I will check and put up on the screen with magic like this what the median mark was so that you can know that. So overall, you can see you perform very highly. I would not normally expect to see the curve swayed quite that high towards the 20s, and there are a number of people who got marks in the 19s, which is pretty extraordinary, to be perfectly frank. Okay, so let's get to the crux of all of this. What were the top issues that we saw? Actually, these are in no particular order, but observations that we made included: make sure that you answer the question. Many of you didn't actually address your personal response or what it means for you. Instead, you went kind of high level for the profession. Again, not something we were particularly harsh on, to be perfectly frank, but I think it's really important to make sure that you address the criteria and that you answer the question. And particularly the second half of the question, what does this mean for you, was often either overlooked or done really quite superficially. In the research criteria, remember that research is more than a citation. And in fact, in this particular assignment, the formatting of your citation was actually addressed in the first criteria, which went to the way that you wrote. And by the way, you write very well. It was really hard to see anything that really stood out with writing generally, beyond some things that I'll mention in a minute. But clearly words are the tools of our trade, so being able to write well is really important, and I'm really pleased to see the strong level of written language that's in this particular cohort. But when it comes to research, research is more than just citing. When you demonstrate research, you're demonstrating that you are actually making sense of, synthesizing and analyzing the materials and using them to bolster your argument or to give it more credibility. One of the things that I found personally very surprising is that the question asks you to essentially assess yourself against the criteria that were given to find out whether you aligned yourself with one of 4 different moral frameworks or ethical frameworks through which to approach the ethics of being a lawyer. The text provided an assessment tool. Very few of you actually used the assessment tool itself. Most of you went straight to, look, this is what feels right to me. Again, I would reward that highly in the research requirement, but also when you do good research, it helps bolster your arguments. Also thinking about the sources and the credibility of the research that you use. Really strong research will often incorporate data or information that might at first glance seem contrary to the point of view that the writer is putting forward. But by effectively demonstrating the reasons why you think that your opinion is stronger, or demonstrating that you've anticipated the criticisms, you actually end up not only bolstering your research grade, but also the argument and analysis grade. And when we get to it and we talk about the duties that we have to the court, they very clearly include a duty to inform the court of the law, including law that might not be in the best interest of our client's particular position. One of the things, just talking about that research piece and the use of research to critically reinforce the views that you have, one of the things that also interested us was many of you were much more critical and reflective in the conversations that you had with others than you were in your individual pieces. And not universally, but it's almost true to say that the people who did best were the ones who really engaged in the conversation. And so those of you who left it to the last minute, it was a little bit harder for you to do well. So what else? Okay, writing. Many of you, most of you, were well over the word limit. I've got to say we were pretty relaxed on this because it wasn't easy to be concise and to do well. Again, word limit itself, while there was a word limit that was imposed, when you look at the assessment criteria, there was no basis in this assessment criteria beyond the question of how well do you write for us to really remove marks. I hate using that term, remove marks. I have a very Catholic view of marking. It's not that you start off with 100 marks and you lose things for things you do wrong. You start off with 0 and you earn marks for things that you do right. And in this particular case, and it's often the case, and you'll find this with the second assessment, when there is a word limit, for the most case, 99.9% of cases, if you are well over the word limit, that means that you haven't written clearly and concisely. And if you are significantly under the word limit, it usually means that you haven't gone deep enough. So really pay attention to that. Also, we are quite limited in our time. You know, we have 130 odd to assess in a relatively short time, and we're busy people anyway. So being well over the word limit, you know, makes us a little bit cranky while we're doing it. When we're cranky, maybe we're not as objective. I'm not saying we're not, and in fact I'm pretty sure that we are as objective, and that's one of the reasons we're pretty soft on word limit this time around. But it will be significantly more important and more relevant when you have a longer piece, because it is much easier to design an assessment task that can be done well when you've got more words to work with. In relation to that, the way that you write is really important here. Now, one of the things, even though it's a short piece, do try and use active language. This is particularly in this particular form, which was really more like a blog post, and you were asked for your personal opinion, using pronouns, using the I and me and you were completely relevant there. Using this passive language that is often useful in research when you're trying to separate yourself from the research. Yes, there is a time and a place for doing that kind of research assignment, but in this particular assignment, we were looking for active language. We were looking for you to share your opinion rather than a kind of gentle approach to what the world should be doing. Verbs are never optional, by the way. We need one in every sentence. Every paragraph should have a single idea. Remember that communication is ultimately what your reader does. It doesn't matter what you write. It matters what we understand from your writing, which really means that you have to think about the structure of your writing carefully and make sure that your key ideas come out really clearly. In a longer assignment, you can use headings to do this, and that will be really helpful. And a number of you, well, you know, it was kind of a, you know, made it a little bit I want to say boring without saying boring, a little bit kind of obvious. Some of you use the questions as headings. And the benefit is, whilst there was a risk that it was just didn't show any of your personality, didn't actually really help you shine out, it did keep you on track, which is probably in the, in the short term more important. Also, probably the biggest point from me looking at them is if you've got an opinion, I think it is really important to explain why you think something. So telling us that a particular framework resonated with you more, that's not even halfway there. I want to know why. Now, again, if you had done the assessment, actually use the diagnostic tool to not only come up with your gut feel of what made more sense to you, what you thought was right, but by going through a series of exercises to work out, well, what would you do, and assessing yourself against those criteria, you would have been exposed to a number of different examples of different ways that these ethical dilemmas might play out in real life, and that would have given you the opportunity to write about those. And we rarely saw that, to be perfectly frank, which was a little bit disappointing. I know another comment that many of you will have received, that it's really difficult for you to talk about ethics at all without referring to the Australian Solicitor Conduct Rules or to the Uniform Rules generally. Again, the criteria didn't actually specifically require that, and nobody lost marks so much because they didn't do that, but you could have bolstered your credibility by using examples from the rules quite easily. So look, overall, as I said, we were super happy. I've been clutching at straws a little bit, as you can see here, to find ways to help you improve. Make sure that you look at the feed forward that I've prepared for the second assignment. That's a much more robust assignment, and I think you will find it much more taxing. Probably the biggest piece of advice that I could give to at least a third of you, if not more, is make sure you follow the instructions in relation to the logistics for the assignment. Please make sure that you submit on time. Please make sure that you do not leave it till the last minute. Ideally, you will make sure that you're finished at ideally a week, but maybe at least 3 or 4 days before, so that you can take a deep breath, separate yourself from it, and then do a full and fulsome proofreading before you submit. Make sure that you reference properly, but also judiciously. As I mentioned early on, and probably the biggest focus here is research is more than just citing sources, and make sure that you use the best sources to support what you're doing. So if you have a choice between a primary and a secondary source, make sure you use the primary source and use it well. But overall, I'm really looking forward to reading what you do for the second assignment, because the first ones were just so enjoyable to look at. All the best. Cheers.